Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses, and I too honor the Gold Star families who are here and appreciate them sitting through and having to relive some of this. I would point out that you've been mentioned about the 7,000 prisoners released. Part of the Doha agreement was to release 5,000 of those prisoners. Isn't that right, Colonel Krumich?
I would have to go back and look at the numbers, but
Well,
that was part of the Doha agreement. If
Yeah.
conditions were met and people were acting in good faith, that there would be steps taken.
Now, as I understand it, you were the chief of staff at Special Operations Command Central, starting back in 2019?
I was.
So while you were there, why you said over and over and over and over, we've heard this, there was no plan, no plan, no plan. Did you see any planning during the time you were there, starting in 2019, leading up to Doha?
Well, to be clear, US 4A had plans. Like on the military side, and this is something I want to make sure is really clear, the military has military plans, and they executed them with under great duress, and they executed very well. Both the acting of the withdrawal, which was key. I mean, they did that in an incredible timeline, and it's a testament to the planning and the execution given the nature of the plan. And the actual NEO itself, to get 120,000 people out.
I appreciate that. I know how well our military performed and how many people were removed, but why then do you keep saying there's no plan, no plan, no plan?
No, I don't think I said that. I said that there was a
when
plan.
Somebody up here keeps saying it.
No, the plan that we put forth as the military recommended course of action was not chosen. And a separate course of action was selected by the administration, which focused on the diplomatic footprint. Going back to my earlier testimony, there was 3 goals. The first was having the diplomatic.
I've got the testimony. I can read it. You know, talk about diplomatic solutions. This is a committee that looks at foreign affairs, not at military. That's a different committee. So I'd like to get back to some of the diplomacy. We've heard a lot about how the women and children left in Afghanistan, or women and girls, are being so mistreated. Isn't it true that during the negotiations for the Doha plan, there were no women at the table, no women in the room? Would that have made a difference in some of the decisions that were made? Doctor, could you comment on that? Dr. Kalinda?
I wasn't in the room at Doha. I know certainly on the Taliban side, there are no women present. I think on the American side, maybe there were. So that's all I can.
How about as part of the Afghan government, as Mr. Kim was saying, that they weren't in the room either, were they?
No, they were not in the room.
Okay. Well, another thing is reform that we've got to look at fixing this. We've got to look at how to make it better, not just keep going over and over and over again about how terrible it was. We acknowledge that. There were mistakes made. Our hearts go out to those families, but let's try to prevent it from happening again. Maybe one of the reforms that we could make and talk about is expanding that Afghan adjustment, I think, or Afghan Agreement Act, where we look at the number of visas that are provided to get families out. Can we expand that? Would that make a difference? Would that be helpful?
I was talking with Congresswoman. I was speaking with one of my former interpreters yesterday, who I helped get a special immigrant visa. And his family is still in Afghanistan. His parents, he's got siblings still in Afghanistan under threat. And it would be wonderful if immediate family members of our SIV holders could qualify as well.
Well, let's do something. Let something come from this other than just a rehashing. I think that's something that the committee should look at. You also mentioned that in your written testimony, some of the solutions systemic solutions, the problem with the silos, nobody on the ground. Would you just lay out for us some of those other solutions so we can read it, but let's put it on the record?
Sure, Congresswoman. The first one I mentioned is we need a basic national security doctrine. The military call it a doctrine or set of terms and concepts. So we're using, across agencies, we're using the same terms to mean the same things. I was in the White House Situation Room listening to people use the word defeat, reconciliation, other terms to mean completely different things, and that impeded communication, undermined our ability to coordinate. The terms evacuation and withdrawal mean different things to different people. If we were speaking the same language within any administration across agencies, then we would have a much greater chance of improving communication and coordination, fewer things falling through the cracks. Second, or related to that, is we need to have a doctrine about war termination. The military doesn't have one. The State Department doesn't have one. State Department's got no expert body of knowledge on how to conduct wartime negotiations in which the United States is the active participant, and it has not worked out well every single time. So that expert body of knowledge is not difficult to create, and something that could be done fairly rapidly. The next reform is to actually put somebody in charge on the ground of our wars. So instead of right now all the silos, deploying by silos, so the lowest ranking person that anybody on the ground reports to, the senior leaders on the ground report to, the lowest ranking person they all report to is the President of the United States. I mean, you can't run a business that way. You certainly can't run a war that way. So we need a congressional equivalent of like a Goldwater-Nichols Act for the interagency, which gives the president the capability to appoint a senior civilian or military official to be in charge of our all U.S. efforts on the ground, and everybody reporting to that individual. And that person is then held accountable by the president for achieving U.S. aims, and can also appear before Congress for proper oversight and accountability. We're missing that today in this hearing. There's no one person Congress can point to and say, talk to us about this disastrous evacuation. And then the final point is we need a much better doctrine for how we build developing military institutions. The way we built the Afghan military was in our own image and likeness, because that's what we knew. But there are other models for militaries, and if we had a greater menu of options, and what sort of considerations would make one option more advantageous than another, we could have built an Afghan military that was much more self-reliant, much less dependent upon us. And quite frankly, I mean, I'm a consultant. I work with clients, and I've got an ethical obligation to make sure that when we part ways, which we will always do, that my clients are better off and they're able to soar to new heights on their own. What we did, creating such a dependent military, was malpractice.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely, Ms. Titus. And I would think, just personally, that if the president doesn't delegate an authority, then he has the authority, and the individuals report to the president directly, should he not delegate somebody. In that, I now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll just briefly say the first time I was in Afghanistan was shortly after we went in 2001, and I observed that it was a shithole. I observed that it was never much of a country. I went to the so-called palace, and I was underwhelmed by the facility that the king had occupied. So it doesn't surprise me that 20 years later we still had problems. During that time, I saw rapid corruption, including Karzai, who he and his brother raped the country of, let me rephrase it, raped the American taxpayers of billions of dollars. We can talk for as long as anyone is allowed about the failures of Afghanistan, but I do want to talk about the subject du jour here for a moment. Sergeant Major, you laid out the difference in the facilities, one which was defendable, one which was able to almost occupy a siege if necessary, but if I'm correct, would have required some flexibility in the number of personnel. In other words, if you have a mandate of less than 1,000 and they have to include the embassy then you really don't have the flexibility to use Bagram. Is that correct?
Sir, Bagram, that being such a large military installation, it had 84 guard towers, and that takes a significant amount of manpower to man.
So given maybe double the amount, 2,000 or so, you could have defended that air base, and that's 2,000 not including the people operating aircraft and other things that might have been left there. But Bagram could have been maintained and would have been safer had we had some flexibility from the commander-in-chief as to the number of personnel, correct?
Sir, if you had 2,000 people, Bagram would be a much safer location.
Okay, colonels, I'll address you together for a moment. You both went to the war colleges. You both went command and general staff. So I'm going to go through a little quick history. I'll try to be as quick as possible. During Vietnam, the now 100-year-old Henry Kissinger negotiated what some would call a flawed agreement. You know, they had these peace agreements. But both during the time and afterwards, isn't it true that when Richard Nixon saw failures to comply, saw aggression, saw an attempt to take ground by his adversaries, being the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, he bombed the shit out of them? Is that correct? Using a technical military term. Am I not remembering history that if you're non-compliant with it, that the commander-in-chief uses his or her authority to essentially let them know that there was a consequence for not obeying an agreement?
That is my recollection.
Okay, so knowing that the commander-in-chief had a history in what people often call that failed withdrawal of Saigon, which, by the way, was long after we had left and our military had left, and it really was a post-period. We certainly could have a discussion about failure to plan a neo-sufficient. I'd like to just go on to one other, Benghazi. There are similarities with Benghazi, which seems to be there was no plan to withdraw, the military didn't know who could do it, and the like. And the facilities were insufficient. In the investigation of Benghazi, what did we find? We found that the facilities chosen, the facilities in which the ambassador was hunkered down, were not compliant with any State Department requirements. In fact, he died because the fuel tank was right next to where he was supposed to be in a safe house. So, Sergeant Major, I'm going to come back to you. The actual loss of 160 human beings plus and 13 of our service members, can it be reasonably attributed to the difference in facilities chosen between Bagram versus HKIA?
So the events that happened on Abbey Gate, I believe that if that would not have occurred in Bagram. The defense that Bagram held, the ability to see for hundreds of meters, and the defense in depth of those control points, I do not believe the result would have been the same.
Okay. I'm not going to defend the work of the Secretary of State, Pompeo, in the Doha agreement, but I will ask Colonel Carwin, I think I'll start with you. Am I correct that there roughly were sort of 9 months and 9 months, 9 months of the Trump administration, followed by 9 months of, nearly 9 months of the Biden administration? Each of them had 9 months, more or less, to make decisions on that plan. What would you say were the fatal flaws during that first 9 months? Did, for example, the Trump administration withdraw troops to an artificially low level? Did they signal in a way that would cause people to evacuate? Go through just quickly. Were there actions during the Trump administration that you can say absolutely led to the events that cost 13 members' lives that you can point to today?
Not during the Trump administration. I don't see a direct causation during that time period.
And wasn't there, during that next 9 months, plenty of time to make adjustments based on the actions of the Taliban during that next 9 or so months?
In my opinion, there was time to make adjustments.
And were there any adjustments made that you know of during that period of time that said to the Taliban that there would be consequences for their violations?
No, and that was our failure in the Doha Agreement. We did not hold them accountable to meeting those conditions, yet we continue to withdraw.
Okay. Lastly, the closing, the release at the time of that 5,000 to 7,000 bad guys, if you will, was that related to the agreement, or was that inherently related to the closing of Bagram?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, were they released essentially simultaneous with the closing of the air base? Sergeant Major, you were probably the closest to knowing the time schedule.
Sir, I do not know the timeline.
Okay, we'll take that one to find out later. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. At this point, we'll recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Steen, for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Crow. I thank you, our witnesses, for testifying today, and of course, even more, thank you for your service to our country. I also recognize the service members in the audience, veterans and service members, as well as Gold Star families. My heart is with you, our gratitude is with you, and it's something we can never repay. This 20-year war cost our country so much, and while the end was devastatingly heartbreaking, we could not continue to send Americans to fight a war no longer in our vital national interest. We owe a tremendous debt to the more than 2,400 U.S. service members killed and the more than 20,000 wounded during the 20-year conflict in Afghanistan. And we are here to understand what happened and, importantly, to learn how do we do better in the future. As my Democratic colleagues have said, August 2021 did not happen in a vacuum. This was a 20-year war. And to understand that what happened, we need to look at the broader context. Colonel Crumrich, you testified in response to a question from my colleague, Mr. Kim, that prudent steps were taken in 2020 to start withdrawing troops, but later, when we saw that the conditions weren't being met by the Taliban, General Milley and others ceased the drawdown. But isn't it true in January of 2021, President Trump further drew down U.S. troops just days before the change of administrations?
I would have to go back and look. I don't know the specific answer to that question.
I believe it is. I think maybe drew down to 2,500, literally within days of what we would hope was a peaceful transfer of power. Do you believe that President Trump knew that the Taliban was not meeting the Doha deal?
Yes, which is why there was a halt on the withdrawal in late 2020.
And yet a continued withdrawal in January, just days before he was to leave office.
I would have to go back and look at those numbers.
If you would provide those to the committee, that would be really helpful. And I think we need the record to be as clear as possible. For all of you, what lessons should U.S. civilian and military leaders take from this war? Colonel Kalenda, as you point out, what happened in Afghanistan is not unique. There was Iraq. Before that was Vietnam. I had two brothers who served during the Vietnam War in the Navy. My eldest brother, Bob, served two tours of duty in Vietnam on destroyers and hospital ships. I remember as a little girl the devastation of that war and, of course, of the end of that war. How do we prevent another such disaster, Colonel?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I'm not sure if Minersville, Pennsylvania is in your district, but one of my troopers, Dave Boris, is buried there at the cemetery.
Oh, my. Thank you for telling me that.
I wrote this book, Zero Sum Victory, What We're Getting Wrong About War, to address the exact question that you posed. I think there are a lot of different reforms that we need to make so we don't have a disaster like this occur again. I identified a few of those in my written testimony. To include the fact that we need to put somebody in charge on the ground, in charge of all U.S. forces. We need a we need the State Department to develop an expert body of knowledge for conducting wartime negotiations in which we're a participant. I found the whole process leading up to the Doha Agreement to be deeply troubling, where instead of trying to focus on a deal and putting a total withdrawal of U.S. troops on the table immediately, as participants have told me happened, we should have instead worked this a bit more like the Northern Ireland peace process, where it was a step-by-step process, testing the Taliban's bona fides and intentions to see if they would uphold their commitments. And then you got to make sure that you got accountability and somebody on the ground who is able to make those determinations about accountability in the event the adversary doesn't uphold their terms. Finally, we need something just as basic as a national security doctrine, a set of terms and concepts, so we're all the same terms mean the same things to the same people. We don't have that right now. So DOD speaks one language, state speaks a different language, the intelligence community speaks a third language, and coordination, good strategy, good policy falls through the cracks.
I thank you, and I see my time has expired. Again, I thank you all for your service, and for those in the audience, thank you also. I yield back.